Welcome to this presentation, where we're going to dig a little bit deeper into customer service and talk about using de-escalation skills. As discussed earlier in the learning path, as the school secretary, you are the face of the school, as you're the first person with whom people come into contact when they visit the school or when they call. And let's face it, you're on the front lines, and being that first person with whom people come into contact, you need to be able to diffuse any situation that arises. This is where de-escalation skills come in handy, and they help us to provide and maintain a professional environment. In order to use verbal de-escalation, we have to understand what it is first. It's an intervention that we use with individuals who are aggressive or are at risk for aggression, so we can prevent any situation from escalating further. But in order to use verbal de-escalation, we need to be able to understand social cues. What are people telling us through their body language, through their voice intonation, and other things? We need to be able to analyze situations and understand when they're going downhill. And most importantly, we need to be able to employ strategies to diffuse situations or de-escalate any conflict that might come about. So when we're communicating with individuals, we need to be able to understand what they're thinking and what message they're trying to get across. We need to be able to identify any signs of escalation that they're demonstrating. By the same token, we need to be able to identify any signs of escalation in ourselves. Are we getting worked up about something? And we need to be able to act accordingly. We need to be able to implement strategies in order to diffuse any situation that could go wrong or is going potentially wrong. When you see or recognize that a situation is going wrong or has the potential to go wrong or escalate, it's important to understand some key concepts, such as reasoning with an angry person is not possible. When a person's angry, they're in a defensive stage. And in that defensive stage, or while in that defensive stage, an individual is not acting rationally. They're not thinking rationally. They're not saying things that are rational. And therefore, it's difficult to reason with anybody who is being irrational. Therefore, we want to reduce their level of agitation so that we can get some message across or to understand what they're really trying to say, which is difficult because de-escalation techniques are not normal for us. We have our fight or flight reflexes that kick in sometimes, and sometimes we need to step back and analyze the situation and understand that this person is getting worked up, or maybe we ourselves are not making the situation better. So we need to understand that the other person is not always wrong. We could be making it worse, so we have to catch ourselves. So what do? Well, we have to remain calm and centered. We need to be professional at all times, because again, we are the face of the school, which is a big responsibility. And understand that we are human and we do have feelings, and therefore de-escalation skills are not easy to use in certain situations. So it requires practice in order for us to become very proficient and to make it a reflex for us to be professional at all times. So as you might expect, communication is key when dealing with individuals who are escalated or have the potential to escalate further. And so we need to understand that when a person is driven by their emotions, it sometimes becomes more difficult for them to get their message across, for them to express themselves, and for them to understand what we're trying to say when their emotions are taking over. And so when this happens, they become more frustrated, and we need to understand that. And understanding that is going to help us to step back and handle the situation a little more calmly. And we have to understand also that our response and how we say things to them are as important as those actual words that we say to them. In order to communicate effectively, we need to eliminate any barriers and keep the lines of communication as clear as possible by not judging people, by not prejudging them, by not criticizing them, and especially by staying away from power struggles. Power struggles don't help any situations. In order to effectively communicate, we also have to understand the integrated experience, which means that when we talk to somebody, we are going to get a response from them. And vice versa, when they talk to us, we're going to respond to them. And therefore, it's important that what we say comes across in a way that is not misunderstood and that our message is clear. When we are on the receiving end of criticism from someone else or someone who is angry, we need to be able to respond to them in a way that is very professional and maintains the integrity of the school. Now let's take a look at some behavior principles. What is behavior? Behavior is anything a person does, good or bad. And it's important that we understand that all behaviors, appropriate and inappropriate, serve some kind of purpose. So there's a reason for all behaviors. And being prepared for any adverse behavior is going to help reduce our annoyance or frustration with that individual and will help us to deal with them in a more constructive and professional way. And it'll help to prevent, hopefully, any incident that could break out. So when a person comes into the office or calls and they're acting in a way that's less than positive, we need to understand where they're coming from, because a lot of things could be influencing why they're behaving as they are. Some things such as anxiety, they're in a hurry, they're upset, they're frustrated, they're angry with someone else and they're taking it out on you, or even their health could have an effect on the way they act. And as long as we understand this and understand that people aren't always going to think about how they act, we should be prepared, and we can be prepared and able to deal with things in a more constructive way. We should be able to rationally detach. In other words, we shouldn't take it personally if a person acts rudely toward us or acts angry toward us. We need to understand that there's a reason why they're acting so, and a lot of times it's not because of something we said or did. Therefore, having the ability to rationally detach could help a situation to de-escalate. And when it comes right down to it, we need to also understand and realize that the only behavior we can actually control is our own. We cannot make a person do something they do not want to do. But, on the flip side, we do have the ability to influence a person's behavior, and this is where verbal de-escalation comes in handy. Again, in order to effectively use verbal de-escalation, we need to be able to understand and recognize a person's cues that they're giving and understand signs of escalating behavior, such as their vocal cues, whether or not they're fidgeting, if they clench their fists, could mean that they're frustrated or angry, any erratic movements, pacing, facial expressions. Other signs might include questioning everything you say, shouting at you, which is definitely an obvious one, any defiance toward what you say, refusal to listen, refusal to do what you ask, whining, using inappropriate language, threatening, destroying property. These are all signs that we can look for. So what do you do when a situation becomes escalated or is becoming escalated? Well, we have some de-escalation tips for you. As was mentioned earlier in the module, practicing active listening is very beneficial. It shows empathy. It helps to build a relationship with that person. It helps them to know that you're listening to them and that you understand where they're coming from, or at least that you're trying to get an idea of where they're coming from. And it also can give the opportunity to clear up any misunderstandings that might be taking place. And when it comes right down to it, practicing active listening is part of managing ourselves. We don't always have to control the conversation. What we need to do is manage ourselves by knowing our limitations. We need to know when we're starting to feel uneasy so we can prevent escalation as much as possible. So along with managing ourselves, what does that mean? Well, it means that we're watching our body language, we're controlling our breathing, we're watching our voice. How are we coming across? What message are we sending? We watch our vocabulary, watch the words we're using, and of course we're always professional with that. And again, always remember, being calm is the key, as well as good communication. I mentioned that part of managing ourselves is watching our body language. 80 to 90% of communication is nonverbal. Therefore, you could be saying one thing, but your body language could be saying another. So we have to watch our own body language, but we also have to pay attention to the body language of another person, of the other person we're speaking with, because their body language could be telling us something as well, and we need to be able to pick up on those cues. So, watching our body language is very important because we don't want to appear as being confrontational. Some challenging postures that we need to be aware of, whether it's us using them or whether it's the other person that we're speaking with is using them. These challenging postures can come across and will come across as negative and will raise anxiety. So a stare down, shoulder to shoulder, being nose to nose, eyeball to eyeball, pointing your finger. We don't want to point our fingers at the other person. If they're pointing a finger at us, same thing. We don't want to be on a receiving end of that. And if we are, we want to try to de-escalate that individual. They say that eye contact is important when you're talking to someone, but when that eye contact is held too long, it can become a stare and make things uncomfortable. So we need to be aware of any of these challenging postures. When we're speaking with someone across a desk, we don't want to lean into them. Or if we're standing beside them, we want to give them their personal space. We want to make sure that we're at least an arm's length or leg's length away, which is usually about 1.5 to 3 feet. And if you look at the picture here, these guys are folding their arms. The difference is, if you look at their facial expressions tell the whole story. Both guys are folding your arms. Some people say that sometimes folding your arms is confrontational, but you pair that with the facial expression, you get a negative look. If you cross your arms with a smile, it sends a different message. And when you look at these pictures, it's pretty easy to understand what message their body language is sending. The person on the upper left is very hopeful. The person on the upper right looks angry. The person on the bottom left may be frustrated, quite possibly thinking. So it's rather easy to read body language. Almost everyone can do it, and even little children can do it. So we send a message with our body language, and it needs to be the right message. Other people send a body language message to us as well. We need to be able to interpret it as well in order to maintain a professional and safe environment. I'm sure that at one time or another in your life, all of you have heard the expression, "It's not what you say, it's how you say it." This is paraverbal communication. Paraverbal communication means that you could be saying one thing, but the message that's coming across is different. For example, if you ask your child, "How was your day?" and they say, "Fine," what is the real message that's coming through? They're telling you the word you want to hear, that it was a fine day, but the way they said it says something else. So when we listen to a person's tone, volume, or their rate of speech, their cadence, we can understand the message that they're truly trying to send. And of course, along with tone, volume, and cadence, we listen to the politeness in a person's voice. Using manners, saying please and thank you are very, very important. And one thing we definitely want to stay away from when someone is escalating or is escalated is sarcasm. Sarcasm will never help a situation, especially when an individual is upset or angry about something. When conversing with someone, it's also important to use listening skills. Responsive listening skills include acknowledgement. You're acknowledging that an individual has a valid concern. Apologizing. This doesn't mean that you caused an issue. It just validates and lets the person know that you understand that they're upset. An example would be, "I'm sorry, that sounds really frustrating." And finally, agreeing. This can simply be done by nodding your head while looking at the person. In addition to listening, we also need to use positive and helpful statements such as, "Let me see if I can find that out for you," or "Let's call the principal. I know she will be able to help with this." Saying these things lets the person know that you are concerned and that you are trying to help them. When a person starts to act out or become belligerent, they're in a defensive stage and will listen very little to reason. Therefore, we need to set limits that are simple, clear, and reasonable. Setting limits will let them know that their behavior is not acceptable, and it will also let them know what we expect from them. In addition to being simple, clear, and reasonable, our limits need to be enforceable. And I will reiterate some more of the things that we've gone over already. Be reasonable and understanding with others, even if they are not being reasonable and understanding with you. When conversing with them, allow time to think. Take time to listen. Take any threats seriously. Deal with them accordingly. And always, always try not to intervene alone with an individual who is acting out. And make sure you always have a plan if things go very wrong. And now some actions that we want to avoid. We want to avoid shouting, and most of these go without saying. Touching a student or a visitor, other visitor. Any sudden movement with an individual who's angry. Cut downs. We want to also avoid being judgmental. We want to stay out of a person's personal space. We don't want to come across as being defensive. We don't want to argue with an individual. Therefore, we stay out of power struggles. We don't want to overreact with an individual. We don't want to make a false promise such as, "Yeah, sure, I'll tell the principal that you were here and looking to talk to him," when you really don't mean it. Avoid threatening a person, of course. Avoid using big words. Avoid jargon. Avoid analyzing people's emotions. Just try to help them. And of course, we don't want to fake attention. And finally, through your kindness, be the reason someone smiles.